So I just want to welcome everybody to our April 15th, 2021 Navigating Equity Network using the Ways to Equity Playbook. We're delighted you're here during spring break and school openings, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much for being here. We will, as you all know, that CCE is one of our co-sponsors along with the Santa Clara County Office of Education and the Inclusion Collaborative. And you can see that we have today's meeting and we have next month's meeting on May 20th, and we are done with our series for the year. So we are excited that we've had such good turnout, and we're delighted that you're here today. And if you need to know how to get the Ways to Equity Playbook and all the information that goes along with it, you can go to the sccoe.org website right here. We actually have Carousel Real Estate, and you can click anywhere on our homepage from Santa Clara County Office of Education on that beautiful California One Highway to Success, which is the grant project that we had for 2 years with CDE, and the Ways to Equity Playbook came out of it. When you do click onto that, you'll get to the Ways to Equity page, which is on the Inclusion Collaborative website. In the middle here is where you can actually get the playbook, and the tools for the playbook are on the right, and they're extra curated tools that we felt were really supportive of our work with the Ways to Equity Playbook. And then learning more about the Ways to Equity Playbook is where we have all of our Navigating Equity Network meetings recorded, and our overview with CDE webinar. So that's where you can get all information about the Ways to Equity Playbook. So available for access, as I said, is an overview of the webinar, and then we have all of the PowerPoints and recordings of our networks in the past since November. And then we have tools and links to support the Ways to Equity Playbook. So please go to sccoe.org and find that beautiful carousel. So welcome in logistics. This is being recorded, and please use your Zoom chat to feature, propose your questions. We will answer your questions in the chat, and if it's a small group, like I think it is, we will be very cozy and be able to talk to each other with our voices. Please mute yourself, and thank you so much for being here today. Today, we are hoping to really spend focused time on students with disabilities. And so we want to really look at the needs, conditions, and circumstances of students with disabilities in California's K-12 system. Describe the equity challenges that really look at the experiences of students with disabilities that they're facing in their school or district. And I think right now, coming out of COVID, we hope, I shouldn't brag about that, but and going back into the classroom, I think is a really opportune time to take a look at this. And then identify Ways to Equity Playbook content and tools and strategies in there that you can use and specifically pull out for looking at your students with disabilities. So moving on, today's contributors are Dr. Burtz. Hello, Angela. And we have Dr. Erica Boas. Hello, Erica. And we have Dr. Anna Marie Villalobos. Thank you for being here. And Kelly Wiley is on another meeting that I've already been on. So we have a lot of things going on at April 15th. And I'm Kathy Wall. So thank you for being here today. We actually, one of our amazing activities that we did a couple network meetings ago was to develop bumper stickers. And so we wanted to share some of them that we had developed by participants in there. Include me in the learning, not just in the space, the change, be the change you want to see in your community. There's some really cute ideas here. So someday I think we'll get some of these bumper stickers out there. What do you think? And these are some more all means all, inclusion, honk if you're an equity warrior, equity warriors unite. So we had a lot of very creative ideas in the past couple meetings. So we wanted to share those with you. Building an inclusive community. How did you expand the use of UDL and the CRP frameworks? Is this yours? Yes, I'm sorry. I meant to introduce my colleague, Dr. Erica Boas, and she is going to move forward with the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. So at our March convening, if you were there, we asked you to do a little bit of homework. If you were able to do it, we're going to ask you to share. And that homework was to expand or implement at least one practice in universal design for learning and culturally relevant pedagogy. So if you did, and if you didn't, it's okay. Please share in the chat, if you take a moment to share in the chat, how you expanded, how you did this, or if you did this, what you did, what you learned. Or if you did not, you can address this second prompt. Now that many schools are returning to in-person instruction, describe a practice you implemented or an upcoming opportunity to use UDL or CRP at the school site. So just as a reminder, UDL is Universal Design for Learning and CRP is Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. I'll just be quiet for a moment and see what happens in our chat.
I can share a little bit. UDL has been a focus for us for the past 2 years. And one of the ways in which we've sort of implemented universal design for learning is around designing specific learning goals that are transparent for our students. And are a way for our teachers to actually track progress as well. And within that, we have focused on multiple ways in which we present information. This has become especially valuable. We are back in person, but some of our classes are still online. We are in a hybrid model. And so this has become especially valuable in terms of engaging students in distance learning as well. And the way we did some learning around UDL, developing common language, and then we actually, through our co-teaching classes, kind of tracked how each team kind of picked one strategy within UDL to implement both in distance learning as well as in person. So we have a lot of work to do around that, but we've built some common understanding around what universal design for learning is and how it can support the needs of all students.
Thank you so much for sharing, Bhavna. I think that piece around developing common understanding is really important. Can you tell us a little bit about the response from your team at your site? How has it been received?
That's a great question. I think because we did like bite-sized professional learning, the response has been overall positive. Just like with any other site, there are people who are ready to run with anything. And then there are people like, I'm going to wait and see. So we have both groups, but it has been overall successful because we've made it accessible. Like we've not said, let's do it all. We've said, let's pick one and then do it really well and then share practices. So every staff meeting, there's time to share practices, how do we fail forward? And so that has been helpful because it hasn't felt like it's one more thing. It's like, let's take what we are doing right now and look at it through the UDL lens. And how can we augment what we are already doing, because we do have several promising practices in place, whether we call them UDL or not, right? So that definitely has been a successful experience. We have a lot of work ahead of us in truly transforming every part of our instructional approach in our classrooms.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations and thank you for sharing. Just want to read Jeffrey's response here in the chat. He says, I wasn't at the March meeting, but my team and I are making plans for next year's PD that will focus on trauma-informed instruction and culturally responsive teaching. Thank you for that. And it sounds really promising and very exciting. And just a reminder that we have all our meetings recorded on our website. So thank you for sharing. I'm going to move on now. Kathy, can you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So just to ground us in where we've been so far, we're all the way in April now. It's unbelievable. To me, it just feels like it's gone so quickly. So we use the table of contents to guide our journey. And we have taken out of the 28 topics that are listed on our table of contents or outlined for the Waste Equity Playbook. We've gone deeply into 13 of these topics. So today, as Kathy mentioned, we're going to explore what equity means for students with disabilities. And just as a reminder, the authors of the playbook are here, but I also want to say that we'll be talking a bit about social emotional learning, and Dupe Thomas, who was going to be here with us today, but is taking some time off for self-care, and we'll talk about that, wrote that section with me as well. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's see, here we are. So here's where we'll be going. And we have our roadmap, keeping with our metaphor for the Waste Equity Playbook. We're going to take a spotlight to students with disabilities. We're going to be looking at data on students with disabilities. And then talking about some proven supports and strategies for students with disabilities, really lifting up those three areas that we've been talking about: UDL, CRP, and SEL, right? Those are all our acronyms that we'll be bringing together today as we talk about supporting students with disabilities. And we'll always end with identifying next steps. So I now would like to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Ana Maria Villalobos. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. The next few slides, we're going to be highlighting students with disabilities and some of the content that you would be finding, that you would find in the playbook. Each of the sections of the focal student groups outline the following. In the playbook, we give a history of the inequitable policies and practices that have impacted these groups, how they have challenged these inequities. We look at current statistics and what tools, resources, and practices can be used to advance equity and the intersectionality, and particularly in this case, we will talk about the intersectionality of students with disabilities across a variety of groups. So today we will explore the content, including an explanation of the California dashboard indicators to understand what the statistics mean with respect to students with disabilities, guidance on how to address the inequities reflected in the statistics, and we'll be using an inclusive, positive, supportive, and systemic approach to this. Next slide, please. So let's look a little bit at the historical context of students with disabilities. So several factors, including segregation, reduced rigor, deficit perspectives, and a shortage of qualified teachers, have led to the inequities that students with disabilities have historically faced in their educational experience. Prior to the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which was in 1975, and I was actually teaching way back then, children with disabilities were segregated from their peers and were not participating in and receiving appropriate educational services. The disability rights movement grew out of the civil rights movement, and lawsuits such as Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1971, which stated that students with disabilities could not be excluded from an educational experience based upon their developmental level. So up until then, students with disabilities, a lot of them, if they had a developmental disability or a cognitive impairment, they were not allowed in the schools. They sat at home. Congress specifically highlights in the federal statutes the segregation and educational disservice to students with disabilities prior to the enactment of EHACA of 1975. EHACA was amended and eventually became, which is a lot easier to pronounce and say, IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1990. Since then, it has been revised numerous times to guarantee the educational rights to all students with disabilities from birth to age 22. Since then, several court cases have further refined this and some of the issues associated with the education of students with disabilities. One of the major ones was the Board of Ed versus Rowley in 1982. And this actually addressed what was educational benefit. This was further defined more recently with the Andrew F. case, where the Supreme Court said that de minimis is not enough. You can't just give a student the bare minimum. You really have to show that the student is progressing in order for it to be a meaningful education. Could someone read the quote on the screen for me? Any of our participants?
Be brave.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. Student offered an educational program providing merely more than de minimis progress from year to year can hardly be said to have been offered an education at all. Chief Justice Roberts.
So that was the more recent decision. That was the end from the Andrew F. decision, which really kind of guides your thinking, where it's not just, did we give them what we're supposed to in terms of compliance? It really is what we're giving them meaningful. And is the education that we're giving the student really going to provide an education that is going to allow the student to progress? That really is what we're talking about when we're talking about educational benefit. Next slide, please. So the 1 in 5, okay, this is a quote from the Forward Together, Helping Educators Unlock the Powers of Students Who Learn Differently. And this was part of the homework assignment that we had from last time for this session. But, and we're going to do an activity with this, but don't worry if you didn't have that opportunity, because we could use this quote for our activity. So I would like another brave soul to, can I call on people, or do you just want to volunteer? Can someone read this for me, please?
I can read it.
Thank you.
The 1 in 5. In the United States, 1 in 5 students have learning and attention issues. This includes those with identified specific learning disabilities, diagnosed ADHD, or related disorders that impact learning. Despite often having above average or average intelligence, the majority of these students are achieving below grade level. This equates to millions of students across the nation whose strengths and potential are going untapped. Our education system is systemically failing the 1 in 5.
So that's 20% of our students, if you think about that. That's a lot, right? So I always like to keep that in the back of my mind, because not every student with a disability has an IEP. A lot of our students may also have a 504, or they may not yet be receiving, officially receiving some kind of support, but they're still in the classroom. And we have to think about how our classroom's designed so that they will be successful. So we're going to do an activity now. And it's going to be a Jamboard session. And I think Kathy is adding the link to the chat. And I think the Jamboard is on page either 12 or 13, and I think I have it turned there, so you should be okay. And do you want to go ahead and? So we're going to ask you to write a comment on the Jamboard about anything that resonated with you related to the quote that Bhavna just read for us on the previous slide, or from the reading, if you got to do the readings on Forward Together, Helping Educators Unlock the Power of Students Who Learn Differently. Okay. Should we go to the Jamboard? Is it in the chat? Yes, it's in the chat. So let's go to the Jamboard.
We wanted to let you know that it's very big, so it takes a couple minutes.
Yes.
So it's Jamboard number 14, and I'm going to go ahead and put it on our.
I'm moving us there. Yeah.
Can everyone see it on the screen? Yes.
Wait a minute. Hold on a second. Oh, yeah. Okay. So you can use a sticky note, and you'll find the sticky notes. Do you want to circle around the sticky note. If you don't know how to use Jamboard, you can go onto the sticky note and just click on it, and then you can write on your sticky note and you can put it on the Jamboard. And the sticky notes are over on the side. Right there. There you go.
We have some good comments, Anna Marie.
I know. Can you make the green one a little bit bigger?
I can.
Thank you. Okay, so 1 in 5 students have a disability. Wow. Yeah, wow. It's shocking, isn't it? And the really good question, what are we doing for these students? The system's failing 20% of our students, essentially. And what I think about when the system is failing 20% of our students, I think about, wow, well, think of all the missed opportunities.
Yeah.
That's what I really think about. This quote brings me back to the many students in our classrooms whose needs may be unmet because our instruction is not designed to accelerate their learning. Yeah. I'd like to disaggregate the data for the 20% race, gender, language, status, geographic location. Yes. Yes, really good point. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. I appreciate it. Does anyone have any comments on the sticky notes in our group? Just a small group. We have a lot of flexibility here. No? Okay. So let's go on to our next slide. Thank you, everyone. So this is, and don't freak out when you see this enrollment, because the enrollment on the graph, it's done every 10,000 students. So that's why it looks like there's this precipitous drop from 1 year from 2017 to 2018. But basically, this is the enrollment of all the students in the state of California, and the red line in the blue bars, and then the red line are the number of students with disabilities in the state. As you can see, there's a trend there. And the trend is that there is a declining enrollment in our population of students, but there's an increasing enrollment of our students with disabilities. So there's, that is a cause of concern. And from 2015 to 2019, the percentage of students with disabilities has gone from 11.8% to 12.9% of the student population. Next slide, please.
Can I ask a question, Anna Marie?
Uh-huh.
Why is the 2018-19 such a smaller box?
Well, that's what I was explaining, because if you look on the side, it's every 10,000 students, and there was 100,000 student drop. So that's why it looks like it's so huge, because it went from 622,000 to it's a 20%, 20,000, sorry. It went down to, because it's the way that it's calibrated on the side.
Right.
It looks like it's a huge drop, but it's not as big.
I always like to point this out every time we do this and look at this. People wonder, what?
Why is there a huge drop? Right. It's
we have
because
less
the way
students.
it's calibrated on the side. Yeah. It's Excel.
Okay.
This is the way Excel wanted to do it.
Okay. I just wanted to review that again.
Yeah. So this is the ethnicity of students with disabilities in California. As you can see, in looking at the demographics for students with disabilities, we can see that more than 75% of the students with disabilities in California are our students of color. Something else to keep in the back of your mind. and that 57% are Hispanic of our students with disabilities. Okay, next slide, please. So when we look at performance and we look at the CASP scores, and the CASP scores are looking from 2015 to 2018, students with disabilities scored at a lower level. So the goal, I'm so sorry, that's my phone. The goal of IDEA is to provide a free and appropriate education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment for all children with disabilities. However, in analyzing the data for students with disabilities, this goal has yet to be reached. The can I, hold on, you guys. Okay, we're done. The exclusion of students with disabilities from the general education classroom often leads to a less rigorous level of instruction of the core curriculum, and it's in a more restrictive environment. We are essentially segregating our students with disabilities. And when you think about who the population of our students with disability is 75% students of color, we are segregating students of color from our general population. Looking at the CASP performance data for students with disabilities, we can see that they underperform in English language arts and score even lower in math. In 2020, there was an interesting study by Farkas, Morgus, Hillmeyer, Mitchell, and Woods. And in this study, and this leads back to that disaggregation and looking at location and who's in the room, they found that students in districts that had large Black, white, and Hispanic white achievement gaps. So if you looked at your African American students and you compared it to the white students, or if you looked at your Hispanic students and compared it to the white students, and there was a huge achievement gap or opportunity gap, I like to call it experience gap in their education, then there was a larger than 0.4 standard deviation for students who are more likely to be at risk for over-identification of being a student with a disability, for the Black students, African American students, and for the Hispanic students. However, when there was a smaller gap in a district between students who were students of color, who were African American or were Hispanic, and the white students, if there was a smaller achievement gap, white students were more likely to be overrepresented in being someone as designated as someone having a disability, as opposed to the Hispanic and Black students who were achieving at the same levels. So what does that information tell us? Anyone want to put anything in the chat on what that information would tell us? That if there's a bigger gap between the students of color and the white students, that the students of color are more likely to be identified as special ed in terms of over-identification, as opposed to if there's a small gap between the students of color and white students, the white students are more likely to be over-identified. Interesting, huh? Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So we're going to take a poll. So in your equity conversations, how likely are you to specifically address students with disabilities in your district, county, or school site this year? So Kathy's doing the poll.
Can you see it?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay. You always worry.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, we got them in.
We have 3 out of 6 so far.
Oh, I didn't do it.
Keep voting.
Want to put it up again? I didn't vote, so don't count me in there.
So in your equity conversations, how likely are you specifically going to discuss students with disabilities in your district, county, or school site this year? So it looks like we have extremely likely and slightly likely.
Interesting.
And 3 of you have participated.
Can you publish?
So we're done?
Yeah, I think we're done. Extremely likely. Okay, good, good, good. Thank you.
Again, this is something you can do when you're meeting with your schools and school sites. I think it's a good, it's a really nice activity to get people thinking about this.
It's also a good temperature read. It gives you information on what's happening at your sites. It's a really good, temperature read, Kathy, like you're saying, to give an idea of what's going on out at the sites if you're at the district level. Thank you. Okay, this next slide is like when examining the post-secondary outcomes for students with disabilities, it's apparent that their level of success is similarly diminished. Students with disabilities have lower graduation rates. They meet the UC and the CSU requirements at a lower rate than their peers and earn seals of biliteracy and Golden State Seal Merit diplomas at lower rates. So reflect a moment on the effect these post-secondary outcomes might have on the long-term quality of life for our students with disabilities. And if you want to, you can put something in the chat. I'll give you a minute to put something in the chat. Yeah, this really sets this group of students up for more than a subpar life. I agree. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is the dropout rates for students with disabilities. If you look, it's higher. Our students with disabilities have a higher impact, a higher dropout rate. And once again, this is statewide. So this is the kind of data, looking at this data, that you might want to use at your district level. And I think Jeffrey put a comment in there. We recently changed our graduation requirements to ensure all students have the chance to earn A through G and access to rigorous courses. That's great. Thank you. You know, it's interesting because I worked at one school district in my career where, when we talk about location and zip code, where I was so excited when maybe 1 or 2 of my students, when I was a special ed teacher in high school level, met their A through G requirements. It was like a miracle. And then I switched to another school in a more affluent zip code, and that was the expectation. In that group of students, I had like 95% of my students graduating, and they had met the A through G. So that tells you what can be done, and how for students, certain students in certain zip codes, we're not doing everything that we can do for them to be as successful as their peers in other areas, in more affluent areas. So, okay, next slide, please. So this goes back to the findings when we talked about segregation. So when we look at the statistics for the state of California, students with disabilities in our state are more likely to be excluded from general education classrooms than their peers when you compare them to other states. So that's not something that California should be very proud of. So thank you, Kathy. So if you look at the data, our students with disabilities are inside the regular classroom less than 40% of the day, almost more than 6% points higher than other states. And then if you look at how much our students that are 80% or more in general education, we are, what is that? 6 points again, 5 points again? No, more than that. What's 6 and 13? Yeah, 7 points, 7 percentage points less than other states. So we have a way to go here in our state in terms of making sure that our students are being included in general education. And even that term, included, that means that that's not something that by rights they should be there in the first place. It's something additional that you need to do. So that in itself, I'm always rethinking the terms that we're using in terms of exclusion, inclusion, and I always think about that because that means that it's an extra step as to why they should be where they should be in the first place. Okay, next slide, please. These are the suspension rates for students with disabilities. If you look at the statewide total, and then if you look at students with disabilities, in 2018, they had a higher suspension rate. And then also in 2017, they had a higher suspension rate than they did when compared to looking at their general education peers. And I believe Tara made a good point about the connotations of inclusion. That word also indicates that the general education setting was not designed with them in mind. Exactly. Good point. Exactly. So when we talk about being segregated and being excluded from the general education environment, suspension is yet another way that students with disabilities are being excluded from instruction and being segregated. It's another way that they're missing out on instruction. That's something to keep in mind. Thank you. Next slide. So another way students are missing out is through chronic absenteeism. So this is from the dashboard. And if we look at over through the entire state at the dashboard for chronic absenteeism in the orange zone, which is the second, I don't want to say, the red being, it's the worst, and then orange being the penultimate to worst. We can look at who is in that zone for chronic absenteeism. And when you look at that and you compare it to the demographics, remember the circle from before where we had the ethnicity breakout of our students with disabilities, and then you look at the students with disabilities and you look at who else is in that sector for chronic absenteeism, huge intersectionality in terms of the students that we're talking about. There's a huge intersectionality. Who these students are, who are our students who are chronically absent? Why are they? We have to start thinking about why might they be chronically absent. And so we have our Indigenous students, our Native American students, students with disabilities, our English learners, our Filipino students, our Hispanic students, our Pacific Islanders, our socioeconomically disadvantaged students, and students with 2 or more races. And when you talk about when you talk about students with disabilities, you're also a lot of times talking about our English learners. You're also a lot of times talking about students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So the intersectionality, you really just can't look at students with disabilities as a silo. You really have to look at the entire picture and the intersectionality of students with disabilities and how they fall into all these different groups and how that is impacting their educational experience. Okay. And I always like to talk about, the marginalization of students with disabilities, and we talk about, it's the dual marginalization, or actually multiple marginalization, depending upon how many groups these students are in, these different groups these students are in terms of having them a successful educational experience. Next slide, please. And I'm turning it over to Angela, I believe, correct?
All right, everyone. So we have an opportunity to go a little bit more about the data that you just reviewed. So you're going to have about 15 minutes in your breakout session to discuss the data, and all of the information that Anna Marie shared is on a PDF file. So you'll be able to take a closer look at the content. So we want you to use the document to gain a consensus on which equity challenge you will focus on based on what we talked about thus far. And then when we return to the main session, we'll have everyone do a share out. So again, let's see, is the file here. Oh, there's the Google Drive. So if you click on the Google Drive there, you'll be able to see all of the data that we've discussed so far.
It's in the chat.
Thank you. You can find it in the chat. So we have how many people?
Angela, I think we're going to stay all together here.
Wonderful. Okay.
Did everyone get the link for all the data?
So everyone open the link and just spend some time, a few minutes to go through, and then we will have a conversation. There we go. I know you all are still reviewing, but has anyone identified an equity challenge found in the data that you will want to begin discussing? And just as a recap, we went over the students with disabilities just in the California context overall when it comes to enrollment. That data was also presented with the ethnicity breakdown. That might be something to speak to. Also performance, outcomes, dropout rates, suspension rates. Does any of that resonate with anyone, or you want to further explain what you viewed?
I would say I'm in a high school district,
Mm-hmm.
and our the biggest challenge that we've been addressing lately, and I think it speaks to some of the data points, is access to courses, access to rigor, pathways, et cetera. And so that's really where our big focus has been and continues to be. You know, I mentioned we realigned our graduation requirements. We've done work with equal opportunity schools, which the whole focus was that participation gap in students of color in AP and dual credit classes. And so we've addressed and attacked that. The basics of shifting our graduation requirements was that, when we do look at the data, if students are not on track for A to G by their sophomore year, they never get it done. And so we've created systems, starting with systems of inclusive practices and restorative practices to address discipline and suspensions and things like that. But that all students, their freshman and sophomore year, will be on track to have that opportunity access to A to G with proper levels of support classes. And so this is something we're phasing in starting next year. And that's been a big focus, a lot of heavy lifting this year, which, during the pandemic hasn't been easy. There's so much heavy lifting going on right now. So those are the ways that our call to action in regards to addressing these gaps has been about looking at the systems and the expectations and giving these kids, all kids, access and then the proper levels of support. And after their sophomore year, if it's looking like they need different levels of support or a different pathway, then we can pivot and do that.
Do you mind painting the picture of what that means for your students with disabilities? Because I know you alluded to in terms of ethnicity, but if we just think about the intersectionality there,
Sure,
what
that
does the
actually,
support class look like for a student?
I'm sorry, I cut you off. What was that last question?
You mentioned those additional support classes to get students on track to meet those A through G requirements and be able to be college ready. But what does that look like in your district specifically for students with disabilities, which would also include different students from other ethnic backgrounds?
Sure, and it's kind of all students, but if I want to specifically speak with students with disabilities, we're creating lots of support with, I don't, what would be the proper term? Academic support classes, study hall type classes that supports the learning that's happening in the math class. Like I said, we have inclusive practices, partnering, teachers partnering with, resource teacher, a gen ed teacher with a integrated one class, things like that.
Okay.
But we're being very intentional. My director of pupil services and her team, they've been outstanding in really keeping this spotlight on our students with disabilities during this time to make sure that their IEP is following the support that we're supposed to provide during these times. We're looking at extending the year into the summer. We're really shifting to competency-based education practices, equitable grading practices. Those are total shifts in the whole system, and that applies to all kids, but specifically as teachers change their practices to more equitable grading, there's the evidence that all students with disabilities, students of color, lowers the D's and F's, and we're actually seeing a decrease in the achievement gap just from the teachers who are really shifting their grading practices. And so anyway.
Thank you so much.
I don't want to dominate all of it, but I was also, Anna Marie, you mentioned experience gap, I believe is what you said. And I've been trying to process and internalize what that means. So I don't want to bird walk, but if there's a chance to hear how your interpretation of that, I'd like to hear it.
So when I talk about an experience gap, I don't like to, just like the term achievement gap, I don't particularly care for that, because a lot of times the reason why there's that achievement gap is because those students were not given the same opportunity as the other students. They weren't given that opportunity, whether it be because they were not, in the classroom receiving the rigor they should be, or whether it's because of the quality of the instruction that they have received. They've been suspended, more, whatever that reason is. And then I started thinking about that. It's not even so much the opportunity gap, it's also the experience gap. If I take student A, who looks a certain way, does not have a disability, who comes from a certain zip code, and I take student B, who looks a certain way, who comes from a certain zip code and has a disability, what is the difference in their educational experience between the two? And what is the gap? What does it look like? And I like to think of that as the experience gap. How has this student experienced education? Have they experienced it in a positive way? Has it been supportive? Has it been designed to their assets that they have, to the way that they learn, so that they can do, they can maximize their learning? Or, or is it structured in a way that this other student, student A, will be more successful? That's what I think of. Tara, you have your hand raised.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question, Jeffrey, because that is a really neat explanation, and my mind went somewhere totally different based on my work about tracking disparities and how inexperienced teachers are assigned. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to look back at the data. So thank you, Dr. Burtz, and everybody for creating that, because I hadn't thought about the fact that we don't really have any student voice in this data. I was just thinking about at the CDE, opportunities that we have not taken to have students weigh in on, the meaning of the disparities that we think we're seeing, in their experiences. So I just wanted to point that out. And if we're wanting for another data topic, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but I really liked the question that you asked earlier, Anna Maria, about what does it mean that schools where the quote unquote achievement gap with respect to the CASP is higher, that students of color, specifically Black and Latino students, are over-identified for special education. I just think that's a very interesting and useful question. And I'm actually still thinking about it. I was wondering if anyone else wanted to talk about that too.
I think for me, that study, when I read it, I was like, wow. Because basically what that is saying is, oh, if there's a big gap for our students, this is what it meant to me, for our students that are Hispanic and Latino, well, that's on the student. They must have a disability. It has nothing to do with the structure of our system as to why they're not performing. And, it's down to that piece where it's, I don't want to say the victim's fault, but it's the fault of the students. It's not necessarily the fault of the system as in terms of why they aren't achieving. And a lot of times I think some schools, when you have a large group of students that are not performing as well as other students, that the first thing to go to is, well, there's something wrong with those students, so they must be referred for special ed. So there's that disproportionate, that over-identification of that group of students. But then when you turn it on the other side and you have a smaller gap, well, the expectation is that our white students would be doing better than our African American and our Hispanic students. But all of a sudden you have a group of white students that the gap is so small that they're not doing as well. And suddenly there's an over-identification of the white students. So what does that tell you about that expectation? The expectation is that white students are supposed to do better than our Hispanic and our African American students. I mean, that for me was like the mind-blowing question of, wow. So once again, when you start thinking about what is the inherent bias that we have, what is that we ourselves have as human beings, what is it, through what lens are we looking at the performance and the achievement of our students with disabilities and our students of color, versus our white students, and why is that whole expectation piece to me, and how you have how it affects over-identification, the disproportionality, which many of our districts in our state are now in disproportionality and significant disproportionality. It's very interesting to me, that study was.
Would you guys mind putting a link to actually read the study in the chat? I feel like there's got to be a lot there about.
I can put the name.
Like it could mean so many things.
Yeah, it can mean so many things. I can put the name of the study in there, but it's in a journal that you have to have access to.
I'll see if I can
Find it.
And then if we can't send it today, we'll send it out to you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. Or I know you guys have the Google folder too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tara, you mentioned capturing the student voice. So I'll just quickly insert something. I spent the last hour we have all of our LCAP surveys coming in now and results. And it's really interesting hearing what the students have to say about how well we are or really are not doing right now in regards to getting through this year. It doesn't differentiate by subgroups or anything like that, but it's been a really interesting way to hear the student voice and how it's a little bit different than other voices that we're capturing, and often the students are spot on. And I will have to, in about 15 minutes, excuse myself because we do 4 times a year, we do a student voice meeting at our schools where
Oh,
our
that's
student
great.
board members facilitate conversations around a topic, and they are so meaningful and they're really interesting. So I'm going to need to go help facilitate that.
That's
That's a
great.
great format, though.
Oh, it's
Mhm.
awesome.
Really.
Dr. Burtz and I was sharing it with her a couple
Wow.
months ago, I think, and it's been showcased at CSBA and things like
Oh,
that.
good.
It's really, really awesome.
That's great.
That is great.
Jeffrey, how do you guys do the surveys?
We put out an LCAP. We were actually double dipped. We pushed out a survey to all the stakeholders, parents, students, employees. That's aligned to our LCAP goals that we've developed this year, and via Google surveys and forms, Google Forms, and through our school messenger, and that we pushed it out on Monday, and we received at this point about 400 responses of a school district of 4,000. So that's not too bad so far. And it's also something that we had to do with the grant money, the one-time grant money that everyone's getting right now, and trying to get share that with the stakeholders and their suggestions for spending the money to address learning loss issues and things like that.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
All right. I think we did our whole group share out, don't you think?
Yep. We can move on.
We can move on.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pick up from here. So on this slide here, one of the first step in the LEA sites classrooms that can be taken is to develop a culture of inclusion and belonging. And essentially a school culture that accepts all students as all of our students and builds in policies and practices that support the inclusion of all students in educational settings as learners who belong and are not added to a learning environment, but are a member of the same as everyone else in the classroom. So we want you to think about, how do we include our students with disabilities, not just in the classroom, but also in learning? So they're in the classroom, but how do you make it an inclusive process to where they are being able to maximize their potential with the support of educators and people in the room? Think about that question. Next slide, please. Wonderful, thank you. So how do we support students with disabilities? I want you to take a look at this illustration here, the systemic approach. So with the Ways to Equity playbook, we take a systematic and systems approach to advancing equity. What we are intending to show in this diagram is how these major areas of work that are highlighted in the playbook exist along a trajectory of continuous improvement. We designed the playbook as a continuous improvement approach to doing equity work. So specific content areas such as universal design learning, social emotional learning, and culturally relevant pedagogy comprise about a quarter of the total sections in the playbook. They are the universally targeted frameworks that can support not just students with disabilities, but all students in the classroom. Thank you. So in the diagram, you will note that in addition to UDL and social emotional learning, there was an emphasis on culturally relevant pedagogy. And so one of the frameworks that we use is CRP, and you will note that it's been used interchangeably and evolved over time. So you might hear culturally relevant and linguistic teaching, or perhaps you've heard CRT, CRP, and the like, but we'll really just emphasize on the origins around CRP. So if you recall the slide with the ethnic breakdown for students with disabilities, when thinking about students with disabilities, we must examine their intersectionality with our student groups. CRP can help teachers to create a bridge between the identities and communities to which students belong, while simultaneously meeting learning objectives and expectations in the classroom. So as I noted, though the terminology and meaning of CRP has evolved over the past decade, and can be used with culturally responsive teaching, culturally sustaining pedagogy. Each of these frameworks and approaches have proven effective in teacher education programs that should prepare teachers to successfully teach students with disabilities, but students of color as well. And there is in the playbook, there is a access to the tenets and how, what those actual tenets mean per terminology. The CRP framework has its origins in culturally relevant pedagogy, which was coined by Dr. Gloria Lassens-Billing. So I'll just emphasize that in her 2011 book, she emphasizes that students must experience academic success, develop and or maintain cultural competence, and develop a critical consciousness in which they challenge the status quo and social order. So effective training is essential for teachers to realize these goals. So how might you implement this in the school system and in the site level? Next slide, please. So when you think of this implementation as a three-tiered approach at the district level, Anna Marie alluded to this. She talked about it earlier. As we think about even beginning to start to support all learners, there has to be a critical conversation around the socio-political consciousness in the definition of CRP. And that is thinking about systematically what has been the experience of students of color, what has been the experience of students with disabilities within a district. There has to be a conversation at the site level. In addition to that conversation, district-wide at the site level, educators and administrators and leaders have to think about their subconscious beliefs and where implicit bias is present and how that might be impacting performance, evaluation, suspension, the services, and so forth. And at the classroom level, a key component of the CRP and even all of the other frameworks that we talked about to support students with disabilities, it really has to do with spending time cultivating relationships and making spaces where students can express their full humanity. So those one-on-one connections, that collaboration between the paraeducator and the teacher and even the parent and the student themselves is crucial to fostering that type of connection. And I emphasize that parent piece because I feel like sometimes it gets left out of the conversation in terms of reaching students, but parents know their children very well. So even thinking about how to maximize their voice in their support services and seeing, is it really effective? How well are students responding to the services? How do they use that when they're at home? Is it feasible for them to continue that learning at home? And if not, what are further interventions that are needed? So that's just a way to think about CRP, but I'll also say even with UDL and even social emotional learning, that district site level and classroom level is a tiered approach that could be useful just to do it more strategically. Next slide, please. Okay. So I see that I am going to, well, Kelly isn't here. So
I am going to take over. Thank you very much.
I'm going
to share with you how important it is to also include that universal design for learning framework. And when you think of culturally responsive pedagogy and students with disabilities, it's like, why don't we ask the families how they learn best? What do they do at home? I mean, you can see how it's really embedded and intertwined with each other. So the universal design for learning, I feel, is truly a framework that we all need to be really well versed on and use it for all students. It's not just a SPED thing for special ed students, it's for all students. And so this framework has been around for 20, 30 years. It was actually came out of architecture, and they found that if you designed your buildings to meet the needs of the people, they actually provided better access for them. And so they really cast out of Boston, who we call the mothership of universal design, really took that and did lots of research and studies. And there's now an amazing framework of UDL that really provides this framework to improve and maximize teaching and learning for all people. It's an instructional methodology that focuses on designing for students at the margins, not just the average, because there are no average, I hate to break it to you, and then really looking at barriers. What gets in the way of students from accessing the curriculum and learning? And then when you remove the barriers and design for the margins, you actually will be able to serve more students. And what's good for the margins actually is really good for everybody. The focus is on providing multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression in instruction. And universal design for learning removes those barriers by learning by proactively and intentionally planning a curriculum so that all students can have access. And so instead of just having your rote lesson plan that you've been doing for 30 years, you actually need to think about the kids coming into your classroom. What are their needs and what barriers could be getting in the way, and then address those to make the curriculum accessible. Oops, next slide, please. Okay, so universal design for learning, this is what it looks like. You can go to the cast.org website. What we did was circle all the universal design for learning principles within the framework that are also CRP and that are also social emotional learning. And you can see how the three different frameworks, CRP, universal design for learning, and social emotional learning, are all extremely intertwined. And looking at the UDL frameworks here, and you can see all the different things that are circled in red: the engagement, the representation, and the action and expression. It's right there. And we really need to encourage and support people to be teachers and educators to be very aware and mindful and intentionally plan everything with the UDL framework in mind. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Anna Marie Villalobos.
So on the previous slide that Kathy just showed us, that slide has UDL and culturally relevant pedagogy. We didn't put the SEL on there because we had that as an activity for last time we met when we did our students. And I just wanted to make sure, because if you look on there, you're going to see some additional ones that could be added for social emotional learning. So the overlap between all three, as we'll show you a little bit later on, is really quite extensive. So when we look at the intersection of universal design for learning and culturally relevant pedagogy, we can see where they overlap. So in this Venn diagram, if we're looking at vary the means of action and expression, that's UDL. Vary the means of representation, that's UDL. Vary the means of engagement, that's UDL. But then if you look at culturally relevant pedagogy and the different parts of that framework, we see where they fit in perfectly in terms of processing, in terms of cognition, in terms of validation, in terms of affirmation. So it's when we ask folks, when we say universally targeted approaches that we're using in terms of instruction and working with our students, they really do have an incredible overlap. So we're not saying, okay, now you need to do, because I know a lot of times teachers are saying, you're asking me to do one more thing. No, we're not really. They actually overlap in an amazing way if you look at the frameworks. And when we use these frameworks, we really are optimizing the learning when we focus on both of these models. Next slide, please. This is another representation. In case you don't like Venn diagrams, here's another representation just to show you the interconnectedness and how the two are related. So a big part of culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogy also is student voice and student choice, right? And both of those feed into universal design for learning and culturally relevant pedagogy. And then once again, this just shows you where they are aligned with each other. It's a crosswalk of the two frameworks and how they're aligned. And a big part of that is effective feedback and monitoring. Because we all know if you're not giving effective feedback and you're not monitoring how students are learning, then you really aren't maximizing what's going on in the classroom. So when we compare the two, we can see multiple means of engagement in UDL align with affirming, strives to support a sense of belonging and comfort. You're building that relationship. When we look at validating, we're acknowledging the real world in which the students live, and we're looking at the relevancy of what we're having the students do, and linking, building that bridge. In culturally relevant pedagogy, you talk a lot about building that bridge so that that student can take the knowledge they already have and build and make that bridge so that then they can then acquire new knowledge. Excuse me. When we look at multiple means of representation and cognition in culturally relevant pedagogy, we're using their existing bodies of knowledge and we're scaffolding to new concepts. We're building deeper understandings, and we're using students' culture, their connections. So pictures of different representations of people or places, using their community as a touchstone, as something in their instruction. And when we talk about multiple means of action and expression, and when we talk about that in terms of processing in culturally relevant pedagogy, what different types of talk structures are we incorporating? Social learning opportunities, are we doing pair shares? Are we being collaborative? Is it individual? Do you use culturally specific modes to help students process information? For example, are you using rhythm? Are you using song? Are you using dance? How are you allowing students to express what they have learned and to express their knowledge? This goes back to, I think, what Jeffrey was talking about in terms of how you're grading. What does that grading look like? And in universal design for learning, choice is such a huge piece of it, and how a student expresses what they have learned, right? So, and having that opportunity to show, I really do have that information, and let me show you how I have learned it and I have acquired that information, and grade me on that piece of it. So that's really important. Next slide, please. So this next slide is really a guide for UDL. And we have in one section, we have the engagement, we have representation, we have action and expression. And if you look on the side, you'll see that there's access, how we can have access for students in that first row. The second row is how we build upon that in terms of sustaining effort and persistence, language and symbols, expression and communication. And then the last one is how do we get students then to internalize? Because ultimately, we want to have self-motivated learners. That's the goal of UDL, right? And so how do we get students to internalize this in terms of self-regulation, comprehension, and executive functioning? And if you look at this, you can see, you know, when we talked about earlier about the different guideposts and how we circled on that page, when you're talking about social emotional learning, self-regulation is a huge piece of that, right? When we're talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, you can see sprinkled throughout here all the different pieces. So this really is an activity that we want you to do. We want you to take 5 minutes, and this is in your PDF handout, so you can just click on the links. Just go ahead and take 5 minutes to familiarize yourself with this document and click on some of the links, because it'll give you ideas of how UDL can be used in the classroom for the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. Okay, so take a few minutes to do that.
I need to excuse myself for our student voice. So thank you for the professional growth opportunity and all these great resources. I look forward to seeing you guys next month.
Thank you. Good to see you, Jeffrey.
You too. Thanks. Take care.
Bye. Bye. So I know, Bhavna, you guys are already using a lot of this at your site, correct?
I would say, yes, we have built awareness. We've started, like, we have picked elements of what we are going to focus on. Our next step is to set some goals around like the action and expression piece, because our assessments still tend to be very like one mode of assessment, and we really, that's sort of at a middle school campus, secondary, like that's the biggest challenge. I think like when it comes to representation, I just seeing in classrooms that we've done a good job of really making the information accessible. But I think our action and expression would probably take us a longer time. Just getting outside that comfort zone. And assessments can be very personal. So we just, that's sort of our next piece.
So this might actually be a really good tool to share with your staff.
Yeah.
Kelly Wiley created this.
Wow.
They used to have a tool beforehand that would go to CAS, and then CAS changed how they structured things. So she put this together for us for today. So you can thank Kelly for this. But it's a great resource. And it's the newest updated version. It's the 2.2. So it's a great resource, and it's a really quick and easy way, at your fingertips for you to use with your staff, so that you can, they could go ahead and click in that action and expression, and it might give them some ideas of, this is how they might want to.
Yeah. I think this is wonderful. I mean, I was just clicking through some of the links too. It's just really a great tool to share, especially with I want to start with my co-teaching teams, and then kind of spread it across every other classroom. So this is actually an excellent tool. I've been thinking about it. We are on spring break this year. Oh, I would really appreciate that, Kathy. We are on spring break this week, so that's sort of the next staff meeting.
We will take care of you.
Oh, thank you, Kathy.
Of course. We love Los Altos. You guys are models. When anyone ever says, do you have a district that's really do inclusion? I go, oh, of course we do.
Los Altos.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, because I know, it's the exact same thing I was thinking was, you kind of like the district. Oh yeah, well, Los Altos, this is what Los Altos is doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it's worth doing a Jamboard at this point?
No.
Maybe we could have our one participant do it and we could watch her. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Well, I was about to put it in the chat, but I'm like, that's kind of silly. So what we wanted to do is really get people to dig into it. So this is maybe something you can use. You'll have the link here, on the slides, so that you could actually, well, let me put the link in for you, because you might want to use it. And that's what we're trying to do, is model as much as possible for you.
Right.
So just click and save everything. Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
So these are some more tools for CAST and CAST UDL, University of Florida Cedar Systems, not Cedar Systems, that's something else. Cedar Resources and Reports. They also have a great website and some tools. And then of course, IRIS Center has all their UDL also. Great resources. Cedar, CAST, Cedar, and UDL are like great to send anyone to.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Next, please. And now we'll have Erica.
Thank you so much, Anna Marie. Okay, so we're now moving into the social emotional learning segment here, and I'm going to be presenting for Dupe Thomas, who was going to be our presenter today, but as I mentioned, she's taking her spring break off to engage in a little self-care. So we're really thrilled that she was able to co-write this section with us. And so we use resources from the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL, as the basis for this section on social emotional learning. So in this segment, in addition to providing a definition of SEL, there are two facets of this section that we want to focus on today. And the first is transformative or culturally responsive SEL, and the other is the importance of SEL for adults. So just as a beginning, one of the most powerful practices available to teachers is having a good, strong relationship with their student. And that is the foundation of learning. Our relationships with each other, the foundation for our social development and our intellectual development. And so to do this, it's important that educators and administrators and everybody working with students learn about students' family, interests, background, and community, their culture, their belief systems. And they can do that by using students' interests and linked learnings to their culture during instruction and non-instructional times on campus. And so that's really the basis of how we link social emotional learning and equity work. Next slide, please. So here, it's slightly misplaced, but not really, is the CASEL framework that we have in our playbook. This helps us to understand those pieces that are part of social emotional learning, and then all the parts that encompass what needs to happen in social emotional learning. So this is the image that we use that is from CASEL. And so I want to take a moment to talk about transformative SEL or culturally responsive SEL. They're sometimes used interchangeably. SEL can't be implemented in a vacuum. And so its practice has to take into account that children come from diverse cultures, have lived through different experiences, experience schooling differently, to Anna Marie's point earlier, and express a range of assets, not all of which are valued by our school system. And those assets have to do with knowledge systems as well, cultural knowledge systems. And so because SEL operates on a relational level and relationships are expressed in varying ways across culture, it's possible that well-intentioned SEL practices result sometimes in inadvertently alienating students. So transformative or culturally responsive approach to SEL addresses this problem by including and engaging students in the co-construction of respectful relationships. So that idea of co-construction is really important here because it puts what we imagine as a hierarchy in schools, it flattens that hierarchy. Because when we're in relationship with one another, we're in relationship with one another. And while hierarchy may be part of what happens in those relationships, we really want to make sure that we enter all our relationships regardless with respect. And so meaningful relationships are developed when all people involved are listened to and their cultures, experiences, and knowledge are valued. And in addition, and really importantly, transformative SEL builds meaningful relationships so that young people, and I would argue educators, see themselves as powerful agents in changing the equitable systems in which we all live. So that's key here. That's a key piece of why SEL is really important in equity work and why we focused on transformative SEL. So in writing about transformative SEL, Jagas, Rivas, Drake, and Williams in 2019 wrote in an article for SEL, and this article is cited in the playbook, for SEL to adequately serve those from underserved communities and promote the optimal developmental outcomes for all children, youth, and families, it must cultivate in them the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action to address root causes of inequities. So toward this end, transformative SEL is aimed at educational equity, fostering the learning environments that will produce equitable outcomes for children and young people who are furthest from opportunity. Next slide, please. So, and maybe our authors and collaborators can enter into this. If you can just share in the chat, what self-care do you engage in to promote SEL in your personal lives? So that would be wonderful to read. As Dupe Thomas, my co-author of this section, wrote, we cannot pour from an empty cup. As adults, we need to nourish ourselves and nurture ourselves so that we can be ready and available for the really hard task that we have taken on, which is to educate young people and to be in partnership with them through their education and their social development. So SEL is not just for students, it's for us too, and I think it's equally for us. We have to model what we teach, and self-care leads to self-awareness, and self-awareness leads to increased social emotional availability, which leads to healthier community, which is about all of us. And so I just want to acknowledge and recognize and congratulate you for taking walks and playing with your grandchildren, exercising and meditating every day, keeping gratitude journal, and practicing self-reflection through journaling, prayer, and walking. And I think, it's important to remember that the SEL part is really can be fun and feels good, right? So I think even though I tend to put it aside for, work and productivity, it's actually part of the joy of being able to choose what you do with your time. So one more thing I want to add here before we move into a conversation is something that Dr. Burtz told us about and is working on with one of their partners, and that is conscious discipline. And so I'm going to share in the chat this link to conscious discipline and just say a couple of words about it. And Dr. Burtz, if you want to share also, I invite you in. But conscious discipline is kind of bridging the discipline piece, classroom management piece, with the transformational social emotional learning piece. And I think it's so key here to think about how we help students to make the best decisions for themselves by helping ourselves to become better people as well as adults, and to really think about what the connection between neuroscience and the brain is, our own thinking, our own feelings, and the connection to students and helping them to become better thinkers and to become more self-aware in themselves as well. And so, Dr. Burtz, I don't know if you want to share anything about this. Thank you. I think are you talking or are you muted?
I was muted, sorry about that. To echo what you said, I typed some bullet points in the chat that I'll just emphasize. But to Erica's point, it does integrate classroom management with social emotional learning and utilize everyday events as social emotional curriculum. So we think about now how, what's going on in our country impact our Asian students, impact our African Americans, and their peers who witness what's happening to people within their community. So all of our students and adults as well. And it also addresses the adult's emotional intelligence as well as the child's. And another part that I'll emphasize here, when there is a lot of tension, or if you think about the life of a student, there could be so much that's going on. But even we work with our students to employ these self-regulation skills and being mindful of their emotions. And that applies to adults as well. Knowing when to ask help, knowing when to take a step back, and knowing when to be a listener when there is tensions between the students that they're working with. So this creates a really great bridge to both have the student and the adult have time to reflect and think about how they work together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burtz. Okay, so I am actually gonna let you continue here. Thank you all for this segment.
Yeah. So we have another opportunity. It will not be the breakout sessions, but we'll discuss it together. And it is there a specific methodology that you use in your district? If not, what do you do in your district site or classroom? And specifically around SEL. So what has been the go-to approach or methodology? If you could just type that in the chat as well as comment when you're ready. Some positive behavior support. Okay, thank you. We use responsive classroom advisory framework. Okay. And as you all put these in there, just an additional request, if there is a resource or a website where we could learn more about the work that you're doing, I mean, what you use, if you could put that in a chat, that'll be wonderful. Because that'll be something that we could share with participants who are here and those who had to leave. So for instance, advisory framework, if there's anything written up about it, if you could share that with us now or sometime, that'll be wonderful. But I haven't a year. Positive discipline approaches and honesty. Thank you, Erica. Oh, I believe it's just us here, so we have the responses. Others that we know about, the restorative justice practices and so forth. Thank you both. I see these here. All right. Would anyone share how has that worked? How is that going? I'm particularly interested in knowing what has it meant for your students with disabilities.
I can share. We the Inclusion Collaborative is our authorized trainers for the teaching pyramid, which is the California version of the national pyramid model. And it really actually goes up to 3rd grade, but it uses positive behavior support as its basis. We do trainings for first 5 and for other early learning folks. And I've been doing it for over 10 years, and it truly has been what's made such a difference in early learning inclusion classrooms, especially because everyone gets the same language. And that's really important to be talking about challenging behaviors in the same way and having everyone trained together, whether or not you're a SPED teacher or a general education teacher. So I think that's something really to think about. The success of it is that everyone is trained together. They all have the same language. And then there's a leadership component to it. And there's also on-site in-classroom coaching component. So it's pretty powerful. And it is, it's a lot of work, but it's so worth it. And it makes such a difference. And it gives the teachers the tools that they need instead of, I need to get a new career.
What I like about how you talked about how it's just like embedded in the practice.
Yeah.
Is really a model for the equity work, right?
Right.
No, like that's what teachers often talk about. Sometimes it can feel like one-off, but even here, how we think about this SEL frameworks and how we use it really can be a catalyst to almost like reimagine what it means to do the equity work, because it's ongoing and it is a process and there are layers to it. And it doesn't begin, it could begin with the workshop or begin with an assessment, but there's so much more that comes with it. Thank you for sharing the PBIS. Yeah. Have any of you ever surveyed your students or interviewed them about their process, the process? So like restorative practice for students who have been through that process. How has it worked? Has it helped them? What do they say about it? If anyone know of any study or information on that.
Well, we do student surveys regularly around the social emotional learning component. But I've also run student focus groups that includes our students with IEPs as well, just to understand better how they are experiencing school on my campus. And couple of, I mean, this is pre-pandemic. I actually had some students come into a staff meeting and we did sort of a fishbowl around staff directly hearing from students, how they're experiencing our classes, and how they're experiencing our campus as a whole. So that was very powerful, more powerful than any data I've ever shared, because these are kids in your classes. So that really helped. And actually, I collaborated with my student council on doing this activity with our staff. So different ways in which we can, and I do empower my teachers to actually routinely tap into student voice during advisories. We have an advisory structure in place to routinely tap into, like, let's say we changed the schedule, how did that work for our kids? Like, all of the aspects, so students feel that when they are providing feedback and then when they are providing input, that it goes somewhere, right? So we routinely ask teachers to do that too. I mean, even in terms of like just workload management, that has been actually very valuable for teachers to hear directly from students.
Thank you so much for sharing that. All right, who's next? I am, let's see.
All right, we had our whole group share out, I believe.
Let's see. So up next, I am going to pass it back to,
Oops.
oh, where is it? Where am I? Dr. Villalobos, back to you.
Thank you, Angela. So let's go back to this model again, where we did the crosswalk between UDL and CRP. And now that we've talked about social emotional learning, you can see how social emotional learning really does fit. Its framework really does fit in with UDL and CRP. And this is the universal approach that we are, universally targeted approach that we are talking about in the Ways to Equity playbook. So when we include the social emotional learning as the third leg of supports, and I always think about one of those stools that, the round seat and then the three legs, I always think of that in my head when I think about culturally relevant pedagogy, social emotional learning, and UDL. I always think of them as the three legs of support. That approach really does give you the built-in support and structures, for students to be successful. And so you can see how it's the SEL, UDL, and CRP are interrelated and inform the other's practice. By using a transformational social emotional learning approach, or a culturally responsive approach to social emotional learning, we affirm and validate our students' and communities' experiences. The use of this lens means that educators must be aware of their own cultural experiences, and they must be aware of their own lenses and must be self-aware. This is what Erica was talking about earlier, of how their own social emotional experiences have shaped them as human beings. This influences how we instruct our students using UDL and how we build in multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression that are meaningful and relatable to our students. A lot of times, teachers generally were very successful when they were in school, and this is why they're in education. So a lot of times as teachers, we want to teach as we were taught because we were successful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the way that we were taught and the way that we were successful is going to be how everyone else should be taught in the classroom, right? So we really have to be self-aware of that, social-emotionally, and in terms of our own lenses and our own biases and the way that we learn, As we use SEL to build relationships and build bridges and positive emotional experience for our students, we are also creating positive learning experiences that are transformational both emotionally and cognitively. We have created a positive, inclusive, and safe environment that supports all students in learning. And something I usually like to do in these types of presentations is I have everybody think back to the most positive learning experience they ever had, either in elementary or middle school or whatever. And almost every single time, it doesn't really have anything to do with how we are traditionally taught. It has to do with some experience that was different than what is usually the usual kinds of instruction that we have. So to me, that really validates how, it could be a lab, it could be, It could be, it could be a field trip. It could be when I got to perform something. It could be a variety of different things. But that, once again, a lot of times that action and expression, that ability to show your learning in a different way and that you are emotionally linked to, makes all the difference in the world. Okay, next slide, please. So on this next slide, we have some resources that are in the playbook, social emotional learning tools. We have positive behavior and relationship centered schools. There's some universal screening assessments, because I know a lot of people, when they think of a multi-tiered system of support and they're thinking about social emotional learning, positive behavior, a lot of times they may not necessarily have a screener for that. So this is a site with screeners. And then also the CASEL, the collaboration for the SEL competencies. So that's the link for that also. Okay. Next slide. And we have the sample resource that we had for today is the Forward Together, Helping Educators Unlock the Power of Students Who Learn Differently. And in that document, it talks about 8 key practices that educators can implement to improve achievement of the 1 in 5 in the general education classroom. And it's interesting because they discuss how it's most effective when educators implement them within rather than in place of. We always talk about supplement and supplant, right? So it should be within rather than in place of system-wide structures and processes that support identification, intervention, and differentiation. So we're getting back to that idea of a multi-tiered, oops, I forgot the D, a multi-tiered system of supports, multi-tier system of supports, that works too. A school-wide system for early intervention and targeted supports for the whole child. So if you have those things built into the system, you're less likely to get so many students that are not performing and then are then referred for special education or for additional intervention. So you want to build those interventions in there, and the supports in there, and then you want to have those interventions at the different levels. So MTSS provides different levels of intensity of intervention and a range of student versus teacher-led instruction specific to that child's needs. So once you talk about a multi-tiered system of supports, you're no longer talking about a teacher-led instruction. You're talking about that individual student and how we're supporting them with those interventions so that it's student-focused and it is not instruction-focused, teacher-led focused. Okay, bye. Next. So this is from that Forward Together report that we talked about. And as you can see, a lot of the information that we are sharing with you today are some of those 8 key strategies: universal design for learning, culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, positive behavior strategies. All of those, I mean, they're all evidence-based instruction, but all of those are the things that are involved also in this. So it is really part of the research, the things that we are advocating for in the ways to equity. Next, please. So here are some more resources for students with disabilities, some tools and resources. There's the University of Florida, CEDAR resources and reports. What's great at CEDAR from University of Florida is that they have those high leverage practices and evidence-based practices, a promising pair. They have videos on these practices. This came out of the Council for Exceptional Children about 2 years ago, and they've done an incredible job on really explaining what the practices are and giving examples of them. And these are high leverage practices for students with for inclusive classrooms. There's a book. I don't know if you can see the book. There's this book, but then there's also a PDF you can download that gives you an overall view of it, a big view. These are great practices that should be in any classroom because they talk about collaboration, they talk about using data, they talk about using positive behavior. So these can be used in any classroom, but they're leveraged in a way to really support students with disabilities in general education and inclusive classrooms, but they're universal. They can be used with any student. And then the last one is Understood. I love Understood. It's a great website because it not only has resources for educators, but resources for students and resources for parents. Fabulous website. Next slide, please. And then here are some additional resources from Understood for coronavirus. And also, once again, Vanderbilt University has some great resources and tools for to use with students with disabilities and gen ed students. It's just, Vanderbilt's just an incredible resource for everyone. Next.
All right, so next steps. Thank you, Anna Marie. We're going to close out here, but this is what you can expect that's upcoming. So we want you to consider how you will expand the use of UDL, CRP, and SEL frameworks and strategies at your site, and be prepared to share how you implemented at least one practice specifically focused on students with disabilities. For our MAIDS network meeting, we will be focused on supporting English language learners. And you can find more about that section on page 24 of the Ways to Equity Playbook. And we do have something that we would like you all to read, and that is the California English Learner and Roadmap Implementation Guide and Toolkit for Administrators, focusing on pages 1 through 10. And we want you to think about the reflection question, which you'll find there. Continue to identify your equity warriors, continue to have courageous conversations. Next slide, please. So our next session is on May 20th. And again, the focus is on supporting English learners. Next slide. Thank you for your continuous work and effort. If you see that picture there of the beautiful student, saying thank you. And for this session in particular, just shedding light and resources and information on disability students is something that's really important as we think about equity, and even as we think about what that means in terms of intersectionality and how that impacts other groups of students along the lines of race, SES, and so forth. So thanks everyone for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavna. Enjoy the rest of your time off.
Thank you.
Being here, man, this rock is so great.